So my name is Astrid Schlürscheid. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor and Dean of the Faculty of Health and Life Sciences here at Oxford Brookes, and I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you to tonight's Gaza lecture. I would also like to say that as a global university, we recognize that the current conflict in Gaza and Israel is distressing for many members of our community, and our thoughts are with everybody who is affected by the recent events in the region. As a university, we are, of course, committed to ensuring an environment in which we celebrate, value and respect each other. And this is, of course, particularly important in difficult times such as these. We do, of course, understand the strength of feeling regarding the current situation, but I would kindly ask that any questions or remarks raised today remain focused on the subject of the lecture and also are respectful towards all speakers and also all attendees. But now I'd like to introduce Paul Brankin, OBE, who together with Sir Ian Chalmers started the Gaza Scholarship in 2009.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. We're here this evening to recognize the Gaza Scholarship, and I'm going to give a very short talk about its history. Before doing that, I would like to say how sad I am about what has happened over the past few weeks in Gaza and Israel. When we started the scholarship, we hoped that over time things would improve. By contrast, they've got worse. The scholarship started in May 2009, when Ian Chalmers, who's sitting over there, and I agreed to let the people... Can you hear me all right? Sorry. The scholarship started in May 2009, when Ian Chalmers and I agreed to let the people of Gaza know that they are not forgotten. We worked with staff of Oxford Brookes and friends to recruit a Gaza student to come to Oxford for a year and study a master's degree at Brookes. At the same time, we worked with friends and other contacts to raise money, both to fund the master's and to meet the students' living and travel costs. We were very pleased when the first student arrived in August 2010. He was Rami Salam Beeb, who studied environmental management and technology. And I've not been in touch with him recently, but the last time I heard, he was living in Scotland and married and had children. Since 2010, a further 10 scholars from Gaza have studied at Brookes, including one, Sewar Altaya, who is here this evening. Two of those scholars, Omar Judah and Hadil Luz, apologies if I'm not pronouncing those names properly, are also here in person this evening, at least I think so. They have all had a positive and successful time in Oxford, and it's been a real pleasure to meet and talk to them. When we first started the scholarship, we expected the students to return to Gaza. That turned out to be naive. There's little work in Gaza, apart, of course, from healthcare. Some have returned, but others have developed lives in the United Kingdom and other countries where they've made important contributions to society. I'm very pleased and proud of what they have achieved. The names and details of those scholars, if you're interested, are available under Gaza Scholarship on the Brookes website. Over the years, these scholarships have been funded by many generous people, several of whom are here this evening. Thank you all very much indeed. If anyone else here is interested in helping to fund the scholarship in the future, please talk to one of the Brookes people here at the front. That is really all I have to say. The current situation in Gaza is truly awful and fills me with sadness. My wife, Myra, asked me to tell you that she is not well, which is why she's not here. Thank you for listening. I hope you find the lecture interesting.
So in the 13 years since Oxford Brookes' Gaza Scholarship was established, it has helped many Gazan students to fulfill their potential and make a positive impact in the world. And to ensure the long-term future of the scholarship, we will be partnering from next academic year with the British Council's Higher Education Scholarships for Palestinians scheme. And the partnership with HESPEL is a co-funding scheme, but we will still need to raise funds from individual supporters, so feel free to donate. Paul already mentioned this year's scholarship recipient, Soha. Soha is studying at Oxford Brookes for a master's in applied sport and exercise nutrition. And before joining us, she was working in Gaza as a medical officer. A significant part of her job was to give advice to patients about nutrition and exercise. But although she had good training in general nutrition, she could not access specialist training on nutrition for exercise to help manage conditions such as diabetes and hypertension. And I'm really proud that Oxford Brookes' expertise in nutrition and health, which in fact sits in my faculty, can help Soha take the next step in her journey. And as Paul, I would like to express my thanks to all our scholarship supporters who make this possible. And now I'd really like to move on to the lecture and talk a little bit about our speaker tonight. Our speaker is Ahmed Masoud, and he is a former staff member of Oxford Brookes University. He's a writer and director, and he grew up in the Gaza Strip before moving to the UK in 2002 to complete his postgraduate studies in English literature. He's also the founder of Al Zaytuna Dance Theatre, and most recently has launched a new artistic initiative called Palart Collective. And I'm really delighted that Ahmed is with us tonight. So please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here this evening. This is a special moment for me. It's like a homecoming, I have to say. I worked here at Oxford Brookes University for about 9 years, actually, left in 2018. So it's really great to be here. And thank you for the warm welcome, Vice-Chancellor, Pro-Vice-Chancellor, and everybody in here. It's great to see the Oxford Brookes Scholarship continuing. I was a little bit part of it when during my time here, sat on interview panels with Mark over there and many others. So it's an incredible thing to see that the scholarship is continuing. I know for a fact that it has helped a lot of people. It has helped the scholars themselves, but also it provided a lot of hope for students in Gaza. And I'm in touch with a lot of them. A lot of people ask me about the scholarship and how they can apply, etc. And just knowing that there is an institution out there in the world that is allowing access to education is in itself providing hope for them and allowing them to continue as well. I'm just going to move the slides, which don't seem to be moving for some reason. Here. My lecture today is going to focus on Palestinian literature, but in particular Gaza. Obviously, it's quite interesting to give this lecture now during this time. I have family in Gaza, my mom and my siblings, and everybody is there. Very difficult situation, of course. Happy to talk about it afterwards in the Q&A if you want to, but we'll focus more on the lecture itself. I've called it Voices of Resilience because people know about Gaza through the lens of the conflict rather than literature and voices and poetry and beautiful words. When the word Gaza is mentioned, people don't connect it with the literary the greatness of the people there. So quickly about me, you heard the introduction. I worked here before in the international office, but I'm also a writer. I kept this side of my career a bit hidden from my colleagues here at Oxford Brookes. Not so much until I published my book here at Oxford Brookes, actually. That I've done a lot of work on, creative work, really, mostly writing plays and novels as well. Those are two of my novels. But I also did a PhD on Palestinian literature, which was really a comparative study between Palestinian literature and Irish literature, trying to look at the conflict and how it shaped the cultural identity of the people of Ireland and Palestine. I looked at poets like now I forgot, of course, Seamus Heaney. How could I forget? Seamus Heaney and Mahmoud Darwish. I don't know how many of you here know Seamus Heaney, one of the greatest Irish poets known, who died in 2008, I believe. So it's really the later part that I'm going to focus on in terms of my lecture today. It's more the academic side. I'll try to make the lecture less academic. It's quite hard to kind of dive deep into the scholarly aspect of Palestinian literature and Gaza without referring to kind of the socio-political context of it as well. But before I do that, I'm just going to kind of look at a little bit of etymology in here. And I really like, I'm a linguist, I like words and where they come from and what they mean as well. So the word Gaza is in Arabic, Gaza. Some of you might know this already. And the full name is Ghazat Hashim. And Hashim was the grandfather of the Prophet Muhammad, who used to be a trader and who used to go on trade missions to the Levant. And one day on one of his missions, stopped in the Gaza Strip and put his flag of the tribe that he was leading on the trade mission. And that's how people refer to Gaza as Gaza, because the word Gaza means to stab. So to stab something in, that's what Gaza is. In Hebrew, Gaza has had a different meaning now. Go to Gaza in Hebrew means go to hell. So that is how it is referred to. And it is actually a saying. So Gaza, Azza, means hell in Hebrew. So you can say you can understand this, but I don't personally. It's a beautiful place. I grew up there myself. We have also a very famous saying by the late Palestinian president and leader Yasser Arafat, who used to always say, "اللي مش عاجبه يشرب من بحر غزة." If you don't like it, go to Gaza and drink the sea, basically, which was a symbol of defiance and stubbornness. So whenever he was negotiating with the Israelis, or whenever he was kind of referring to that place, he would always kind of use that phrase, "اللي مش عاجبه يشرب من بحر غزة." And then the very famous one is a verse in the Quran which says, "اذهب أنت وربك فقاتلان إن فيها قوم جبارون." So we are known as the Jabbarun, the people, the Jabbarun. Jabbarun is a word that is hard to translate in English. It means strongly minded, stubborn, and also determined people. So that is what it refers to. And it refers to when Moses crossed the sea and went, he was told by God to go to Palestine with his people. And they got to the sort of borders of Gaza. And as they got there, his people looked at Moses and said to him, "Are you crazy? You want us to go and fight those people? They're like, they're crazy, Jabbarun. They are Jabbarun people. Go and your God and fight them yourself. We are sitting here until you win." And then one more to add into the mix, the word goes. I don't know if you heard that word before, which refers to a type of fabric. It's a bit like a veil, goes. If you're into fashion, that's what kind of it refers to. Goes is comes from the word Gaza. And because the Gaza in the 12th century was very well known for making fabric. There were lots of tailors in there. It was the kind of the region and the place where many fabrics were made. So in the 12th century, a lot of the goods was imported to Europe from Gaza. It was banned by kind of the religious institutions to actually trade with any Muslim traders at the time. But even though a lot of people got that, got the material from Gaza, and it was worn in sort of like royal palaces and royal events as well. There's a really nice Wikipedia entry. I took a screenshot in there, which you can't read. But if you go to Wikipedia and Google or type in "goes," you get a bit more to it as well and read a lot more about it. So one other really interesting thing about Gaza is that the official symbol of the Gaza Strip is the phoenix out of all kind of symbols. And that is because Gaza is meant to be born out of the ashes all the time. It will always be rebuilt. So that's the good news in a way. It's really good that despite what's happening right now, Gaza will be built again. The bad news is that it will be destroyed again. So that's how the phoenix works, I suppose. The statue you can see here is actually in the middle of Gaza City in a place called Al-Saha. And this statue is a strange statue, I have to say. When you look at it close, it took me a long time as a child kind of looking at it, not a child, a teenager, because it was built in around 2000. It is the lower jaw of the phoenix, the bird. And that picture was around 2005. And the one at the bottom right is how it looks right now. Actually, this is from a few days ago, after the pause kicked into place. So unfortunately, you can see, I mean, it's quite symbolic, to be honest with you, and that's why I wanted to show it to you, in the sense that it is, everything around it is destroyed, apart from the statue of the lower jaw of the phoenix. And the reason why the lower jaw is in the myth, it is meant to be that when the phoenix is kind of reborn from the ashes again, is the jaw that comes out first. So that's why we have that statue in there. One other really, really important sort of element about Gaza is that we have a very, very famous person who comes from there, very well known across the Arab world, his name and the Muslim world. His name is Emam Shafi'i. Emam Shafi'i is a scholar, a Muslim scholar who lived in the 8th century, between the 8th and the 9th century, from 766 to 820. And the reason I'm mentioning him is because Islam started in the 7th century. A few centuries later, of course, with the expansion of the Muslim empire, what happened was, the interpretation of Islam and al-Aqidah and al-Sharia and all of that got a little bit sort of complicated for different corners of the Muslim empire, from Persia to all the way to North Africa as well. And a few scholars kind of came up and became very well known and famous in interpreting the Quran and the Sharia and the Aqidah and the principles of Islam. There was Al-Hanbali, Al-Hanafi, and the most famous one is Al-Shafi'i. And Al-Shafi'i was a poet as well. He was from Gaza. And the reason I'm mentioning him, mentioned him here is because he was the most kind of moderate out of all the scholars across the Muslim world. So his principle basically was, actually, Quran is quite complicated, it's abstract, so it's up to your interpretation. Islam is an easy religion, so try to find the easy solution. So if you find things are difficult and you don't understand whether this is haram or not, if this is allowed to happen in Islam, then just basically take the easy solution, make your own interpretation out of it, or measure it according to what people said. So it's funny that now in Gaza, we're referred to as the kind of extremist society, where we are known to be the most moderate and most sort of relaxed about religion and about everything else. So I wanted to just mention that his famous poem mentions Gaza, and it says, وَإِنِّي مُشْتَاقٌ لِأَرْضِ غَزَّةَ وَإِنْ خَانَنِي بَعْدَ التَّفَرُّقِ كِتْمَانِي سَقَى اللَّهُ أَرْضًا لَوْ ظَفَرْتُ بِهَا كَحَلْتُ مِنْ شِدَّةِ الجَّوْقِ أَشْفَانِي. And you've got the translation over there, but I like to read it in Arabic because it's a beautiful language as well. So Gaza, throughout the centuries, has been the leader in the region of literary movements, of change, in a sense. That even within sort of the Islamic principles, it presented a different picture and a different interpretation as well of Islam. Of course, we can't talk about Palestinian literature and Gaza without referring to kind of socio-political situation and context in which Gaza is situated in. And I've wanted to sort of jump forward a little bit in there to the 20th century. So we went from the 8th century with Emam Shafi'i to the 20th century over here. And I've just wanted to provide a little bit of a timeline of key defining moments for Palestinian society and for Gaza, of course. The main one is, of course, the British occupation in 1916. So Britain occupied Palestine, with invaded Palestine with 100,000 soldiers that came from Egypt, crossed the Sinai, and invaded and occupied Palestine as an occupier, not a mandate as presented here in the UK. I didn't actually realize that the word mandate existed until I came to the UK, but because what is mandate? Who gave you the mandate to actually invade with 100,000 soldiers? It was a key location for them during the First World War, and therefore it was important to invade Palestine because it's located, it kind of breaks up the Ottoman, or it broke the Ottoman Empire into two parts from the east and the west. So it was strategically important for the British to win the war, to invade Palestine with 100,000 soldiers. 100,000 soldiers is more than Britain invaded Iraq and Afghanistan combined, by the way. The other key defining moment is 2nd of November 1917 with the Balfour Declaration. That's when, a year after Britain occupied Palestine, they issued a declaration by the British Foreign Secretary at the time that basically promised the Jewish lobby in Europe to build a state for the Jewish community in Europe in Palestine. You can Google the text and get the text for that. It's not the subject of the lecture, so I didn't include it in here, but you can read that text. And it's a really interesting text to read because it talks about building a state for the Jewish community in Europe without mentioning a state for the Palestinians and those who were living there. So the problem that we're living right now goes back to there, by the way. And I think this is really important in the kind of discourse when we talk about Palestine and the political kind of context of it, because very often this is missed from the debate completely. And unfortunately now, people refer to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as of the 7th of October, and that is not the case. Another key moment is 1936, when Palestinians started their revolt against the British, and that was a complete surprise to the British occupation forces at the time, to a lot of people around the world. People were stunned that Palestinians kind of revolted and led an uprising, a successful uprising at the time, which a lot of people would argue that delayed the events of 1948 10 years later on. Which brings me to the events of 1948 and 1947, where Palestinians, well, the UN issued the partition plan in 1947, and then 1948, the State of Israel was established to what then was referred to as the Nakba. And the Nakba is the Arabic word for catastrophe. That's when we lost Palestine as a country and Israel was established. Around 800,000 people were deported and ethnically cleansed from their homeland in Palestine, including my family. So my family in 1948, my grandfather lived in a village where the events of the 7th of October happened actually just outside of Gaza called Sidrot. And my grandfather was a rich man. He owned a lot of the land, but then because of that, he was kicked out and moved into a refugee camp in Gaza, in Jabalia camp. And I lived in Jabalia camp most of my life as a refugee. And that is kind of, again, when you refer to it, you look at that, you kind of see the events of the 7th of October slightly differently in there. And again, I'm not trying to delve into that subject area. It's a completely different subject area, but because I will be referring to it a lot with my talk in here, it's important to recognize it and to understand history from that perspective. And then I'm not going to carry on with the rest of the timeline. A lot of it is known to you already with the 67 war and then the October war in 73. And then the first Intifada in 1987, and then the Oslo Agreement and Yasser Arafat establishing the Palestinian Authority, etc. And then the second Intifada in 2000. Of course, if you want to carry on, the reason I stopped at the year 2000 is because, in my opinion, we're still living this modern history right now. It hasn't really sort of ended in a sense. Hamas took over Gaza, the rule of Gaza in 2006. And it's still ongoing now. We don't know where it's going to end. We don't know where it's going to go. There will be a lot of research coming out of it, I suppose, very soon. But just going back to Gaza as a sort of a place of literature and beauty, just forget the politics for now. In 2001, I was at Al-Azhar University in Gaza, and the renowned Palestinian poet Samih al-Qasim, who was born in 1939, came for a poetry reading at the university, and I was there. And he was really overwhelmed with the whole sort of warm reception that he received from people. And I remember him saying very clearly that he said, "I've never met people who go to a poetry reading at 9 a.m. in the morning." So that was something that stayed in my mind, because actually, yes, people 9 a.m., they were already had about 3 coffees or something waiting for this poet to come and deliver a poetry reading. And I think this image of a packed lecture hall at 9 a.m. is often missed out when Gaza is mentioned. It's often hardship and bleak pictures of violence that jump to people's minds when thinking of Gaza. But as I mentioned before, this small strip has given birth to so many well-known Palestinian poets who have changed the Arabic literary movement, which I'm going to talk about a little bit here in my lecture as well, if we have time. But I wanted to just also look at why is this important, and why is this important now, I suppose, in here. We're talking about literature and poets. You need to just know something about Palestinians and Arabs, in the sense that poetry is very, very important in the culture, in the Arabic culture. It goes back to sort of pre-Islamic times. We used to have poetry slams in Mecca. There used to be every year as a poetry slam, a big festival in Mecca where the Kaaba is in Saudi Arabia right now. And there used to be the 7 suspended poems. Those are the best poems that would be suspended on the walls of the Kaaba that will stay until the next year. So poetry is really, really important in the Arabic culture and Palestinian culture as well. Our famous sort of TV entertainment in the Arab world is not the Arab Idol. Well, the Arab Idol is there as well. Not my favorite, but it is the Arab laureate in there. So we have a similar sort of reality TV, but only for poetry. So it's important to kind of remember that it is a place of literature and culture and a huge cultural production as well. The only thing that is kind of new to the Arab world is drama. So drama started in the 19th century. We had a lot of puppet theater, for example, during the Ottoman Empire. Drama as theater, I think it's a lot older in Europe. You have Shakespeare, you have many others who did theater in Europe, whereas in the Arab world, it tends to be newer. Fiction, however, is much older in the Arab world, with the stories of the 1001 Nights. You know them already. Kalila wa Dimna, which is written through animal voices as well. But I think for me, like literature and why it is important, I think because the spirit and aspiration and dreams of any nation that cannot be measured through the lens of politics and historians only. I think it's important in order to understand a certain nation, is to be able to delve into their cultural production, because often a writer portrays the cultural context and sociological context a lot better and freer than a historian or any sort of political scientist in general. And that sort of moves me to a couple of quotes in here I wanted to show you about the importance of Palestinian poets in general. So this quote in here is by Salma Khadra Jayusi. He wrote a lot about Arabic poetry and Palestinian poetry as well. And she said that the Arab writer is committed, particularly in this period of Arab national revival, to producing works with a conscious and deliberate political meaning. And I'm going to come and explain that later. Moshe Dayan, he was the defense minister, the Israeli defense minister during the Six-Day War in 1967. He said that one poem of Fadwa Tuqan is enough to create 10 Palestinian terrorists. So the Israelis recognize the power of poetry that Palestinians have and literature. In fact, one of our most famous writers, Ghassan Kanafani, he was born in 1932, was killed in 1972 in Lebanon through the bombing of his car, just because of his writing and his novels. He wrote novels, basically, and he was killed as a result. So I just wanted to, kind of highlight that this is why this lecture is important, is that when you want to understand a certain nation, don't just look at the politics, don't just look at the sort of news analysis, but also the cultural production of people, the poetry, the novels, and everything that is coming out. I think it's the same as like when we look at Ireland, for example. If you want to understand Ireland properly, you would read somebody like James Joyce or Brian Frill or the others. You wouldn't just kind of go through the narrative of history, I suppose. And I believe like in Ireland, the intricacy of Palestinian politics has been a major theme of building a Palestinian literature. In fact, many would argue that the uniqueness of Palestinian literature is attributed to the turbulent political climate in the region. It is worth mentioning here, though, that the Palestinian literature did not take its own regional character until the 20th century. And the reason for that is that because before this, it was all subsumed within the Arabic literature sort of movement, in a sense, which in itself was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans ruled the Arab world from the 16th century all the way to the 20th century. And the Ottomans were quite oppressive to Arabs, and I think even until now, if you go to Istanbul and you say you're an Arab, you're actually faced with a lot of prejudice in a sense. There was a lot of rivalry in there. The Ottoman Empire came as a sort of caliphate empire to the Muslim world. This is how they presented themselves to the Muslim world in a sense. And that's why actually the Ottomans never fought any war as they conquered the entire region. They actually sailed through because they presented themselves as the new Muslim caliphate in a sense, a bit like, ISIS, if you ask me, in a sense, when they kind of started the Islamic State. Not exactly the same, but similar in a sense. But they took control politically, and as a result, they took all of the resources and all of the kind of wealth of those countries back to Istanbul. In fact, they forced a lot of the architects, the artists, and all of anybody who's within the art sort of sector to move forcibly to Istanbul. And as a result, most of that sort of literary production suffered a lot during those centuries. So Palestinian literature didn't sort of develop until much later, until the 20th century, in a sense. And it's also important to remember that the Arabic literature at the time kind of went down into a period of really just working around the Sultan and the Ottoman Sultan, because everybody wanted to win favors. Everybody wanted to go to Istanbul. It became the place to go to, where you go there and you write a poem for the Sultan and you move on. You get a reward and that's it. But back home, there wasn't really much in there. But at the beginning of the 20th century in Palestine, poetry flourished in this period. There were new poets who came up, people like Ibrahim Toqan, Abdul Karim Al-Karmi, Abu Salma, Abdul Rahim Mahmoud, and Fadwa Toqan. Fadwa Toqan is the one I referred to, who's quoted in there. He was one of our leading poets. He was in the West Bank, but also spent a lot of time in Gaza. And those poets gained wide readership, mainly because of their political involvement in the Palestinian cause. Their poetry managed to transform national preoccupations with politics into a description of everyday social and personal experience of individuals who, because of the new political changes, were not able to live freely on their land. Such experience was voiced out in poetic images and metaphors, which still live to present day as a symbol of struggle. So to give you an example, Abdul Rahim Mahmoud wrote a poem, a very famous poem in 1936 called The Martyr. And in it he says, سأحمل روحي على راحتي وألقي بها في مهاوي الردى فإما حياة تسر الصديق وإما ممات يكيد العدا. I will carry my soul on my shoulder and toss it in the valleys of death. I am seeking a life that will make my friend happy, or a death that will make my enemy angry. So this became like a symbol of resistance. And from that moment, the Palestinian literature was kind of relied on as in a beacon for resistance in itself. It was meant to be the voice of revolution, as it were, because what is happening in the Arab world outside, there wasn't really much going on in terms of poetry and literary. And that nation that had so much heritage and so much history of poetry and beautiful words and literature was declining completely. And suddenly you've got poets and writers from Palestine who are under occupation, writing such poetry, such beautiful poetry, with obviously national kind of meanings to it. But to go back a little bit, and despite the political turmoil in the beginning of the 20th century, Gazans continuously searched for new literary materials to read to enhance their poetic production. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was actually Egyptian literature that was flooding the market in Palestine as quite a lot. And that's because the Egyptians, in turn, were also fighting the Egyptian occupation themselves. So we had people like Mustafa al-Manfaluti. Taha Hussein is very famous in the Arab world as well. He was born in 1898 and died in 1973. Tawfiq al-Hakim and others. So because that connection between the British occupation in Egypt and the British occupation in Palestine, the writers kind of connected with each other and read each other's work. And in a way, the Egyptian writing kind of influenced a lot of the Palestinian writing itself. However, it was not until the mid-20th century that they became more involved in creating more an inspiring literary movement in Palestine, which focused mostly on the consequences of the Nakba. And the Nakba is the events of the 1948. I'm going to read this quote from Ghassan Kanafani, who describes that period after the British occupation, after Britain took over Palestine. And the reason I'm reading it is because it just gives you a picture of the political situation there at the time. In 1930, after 13 years of British occupation of Palestine, the Director of Education admitted in his report that since the beginning of the occupation, the government has never undertaken to provide sufficient funds for the building of a single school in the country. And in 1935, the government turned down, that's the British government, by the way, turned down 41% of the applications by Palestinian Arabs for places in schools. In the 800 villages in Palestine, there were only 15 schools for girls and 269 for boys, and only 15 village girls got as far as the 7th elementary grade. There were 517 Palestinian Arab villages which had neither boys nor girls schools, and there was only one secondary school in the villages. Moreover, the government censored books and objected to all cultural links with the Arab world, and did nothing to raise the educational level of the peasants. Thus, in 1931, among the Palestinian Muslim, 251 per 1,000 males and 33 per 1,000 females had attended school. And among the Palestinian Christians, 715 per 1,000 males and 441 per 1,000 females. For Jews, the figures were 943 per 1,000 males and 787 per 1,000 females. So the reason I mention this is that during this period between 1917 and 1948, there was a deliberate attempt by the British occupation to kind of really alienate the Palestinian society as much as possible, not to allow access to education, not to build schools. Even applications from students to go to schools were rejected and turned down. And that's why poetry became very important, because it was the means to kind of connect with the cultural production of the people as well. So moving on to 1948 and the event and the declaration of the State of Israel on the 14th of May in 1948, which dramatically changed sort of the map and where we are right now, really. From that moment onwards, there was no such thing as Palestine as a political entity in there. So there was a huge loss in the political and national identity of the people. So it had a huge effect, obviously, on writers, on the society in general. But writers still stood up to resist in 1948, because they were the only people who were able to actually use their words to kind of transport news, as it were. At the time, there was no radio, there was no newspaper. The entire civil society, the Palestinian civil society, was completely destroyed. The cultural figures were either killed, arrested, or deported. And people spent a lot of time actually following the events of 1948, looking for their own families, in a sense, because some parts of the families were deported. So my grandfather's brother, for example, we've never found out where he went. We never know what happened to him. My grandfather went to Gaza and became a refugee there, but my grandfather's brother, we never know what happened to him. So my grandfather spent a lot of time looking for his brother. Now, he wasn't a writer, so he didn't worry about all of that. He was a farmer. But for a lot of the kind of civil society, the intellectual figures in Palestine, they suffered a lot in 1948 because a lot of them spent time looking for each other, in a sense, and families. And in a way, it's what's happening right now at the moment, because the north, I live in the north, my family are in the north. Some people made it to the south. I still don't know where my brother is, whether he made it to the south or not. He had plans to. I have no communication with him. And I'm a writer, so if I want to write at the moment, I don't think I'll be able to write creatively. What I'll be able to do is just spend time to kind of find where my brother is, because that's my priority in a way. But poetry at the time, because it's oral poetry, people wrote poems and stood up to resist that sort of disfragmentation of the Palestinian society through oral poetry. And it was easy transported. So people wrote poetries about a certain community or a village or a place or a certain event at the time. And writers just stood up to resist to what happened with the disaster. They were the first ones to respond to the Nakba, in a sense. One of those people was Mou'in Bseiso, who is from Gaza as well. He was born in 1927 and died in 1984. And he wrote a lot of poetry and published a lot of books, but his poetry was transported orally, as I said, and was kind of almost like giving updates to different parts of the community in Palestine. Those poems were then sent to radios in Cairo or Jordan and would be read out loud, in a sense. One of his famous poems is called Footsteps, which I'll read parts of it to you now. It says, "Brother, if they should sharpen the sword on my neck, I would not kneel, even if their whips slashed my blooded mouth. If dawn is so close to coming, I shall not retreat. I will rise from the land that feeds me, feeds our furious storm. Brother, if the executioner should drag me to the slaughterhouse before your eyes to make you kneel, so you might beg him to relent, I would call again, brother, raise your proud head and watch as they murder me. Witness my executioner, sword dripping with my blood. What shall expose the murderer but our innocent bleeding?" And this poem became quite famous, in a sense, because it was trying to call on people to stop and not just kind of worry about their personal stuff, but also to reunite, in a sense, around the national cause, because the only way for us to rebuild that kind of family cohesion, this is social cohesion, is through resistance, in a sense, and to reestablish the national cause itself. Following that, something interesting happened in Palestine. There were three sort of main schools of literary movements that started spreading in Palestine. The first one was actually Marxism, believe it or not. Marxism became very sort of common in Palestine, and actually a lot of it was to do with the establishment of the State of Israel. A lot of the Jewish migrants who came to Palestine up to 1948, a lot of them actually were communists from Europe who wanted to start a communist party in there. And in fact, many Palestinians joined that communist party as well. Another thing with communism and sort of Marxism, in a sense, and the two are intertwined in a way, the books were free almost. They were just kind of distributed for free. I mean, people didn't have much money, they couldn't afford books at the time, and the ideas of Marxism and communism were spreading like quite widely in Palestine. And there was a common cause, in a sense, because a lot of Palestinian intellectuals thought that actually the establishment of the State of Israel is more of a capitalist project rather than a colonial project. So they're united because, remember, as I said, a number of Palestinians remained in Palestine. They're 1/5 of the Israeli society at the moment. We call them Israeli Palestinians at the moment. They have Israeli passports because they didn't leave their homes, so they were under the establishment of the State of Israel as well. So Marxism became very, very famous. The other one was Romanticism. And Romanticism is because a lot of people obviously were reminiscent about the land, the village, the kind of the Palestine as a state before, because all the way up to the beginning of the 20th century, and even under the Ottoman Empire, Palestine was an independent state. It had its own administrative rule, it had its own ruler. Of course, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, but it was an independent state completely. Then it was taken over by the British in 1917, and then it was lost completely in 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel. So a lot of people romanticized about the old Palestine, you know, I mean, a lot of people still do now. A lot of kind of, it's in the religious textbooks. I mean, Christmas is coming. We're going to sing about Bethlehem and the shepherds, and everything is part of like the DNA around when it comes to Palestine. And a lot of Palestinian poets kind of wanted to do that, to kind of write romantic poetry that draw the attention to that romantic Palestine, the land, the farms, etc. But the problem is that Romanticism at the time was too vague. It was too escapist and too full of beauty and daydreams, too sugary and too sentimental to express the social and political reality of the Arab world, which was growing increasingly harsh during and immediately the Second World War as well. So those are the kind of two main schools. There were Romanticism, communism or Marxism together. But then there was a third one, which was the modernism school, kind of that people wanted to just write freely, completely. And they didn't want to be restricted to a certain ideology or a certain framework or certain way of writing completely. So the modernism obviously became famous because a lot of the European Jews who came to Palestine, they were all sort of modernist writers in a way. They were all, not all of them, but many of them were influenced by people like T.S. Eliot and the others who wrote beautiful, you know, modernist poetry. So again, a lot of Palestinian writers tried to copy that. There was also the influx of new technology in Palestine, where you had new words like television and radio and others, where we didn't have that in Arabic. And in order to use these words, you had to use them as they are, because by the time the translators managed to find the equivalent word, it was too late. The word was spreading already. You would find poetry in Arabic that has the word otombil. We call it otombil, which is, you know, automobile, you know, or mutzigil, which is the motorcycle, you know. So that kind of demanded a modern way of writing, which became very popular in Palestine as well. I am conscious of time as well, because I think I can see some staring in there in the audience. But so I'm going to jump a little bit further very quickly. I'm not going to dwell on this one. But the other main school that actually Palestinians pioneered, which became quite famous in the Arab world, was called Al-Hadatha, which is different, completely different from any literary school that was spreading in the middle of the century. And Al-Hadatha is unique to Palestinian poetry and literature, but also to the Arab literature in general. And it's not often discussed actually in European traditions. When you think about the middle of the century, the 20th century, people talk about postmodernism, they talk about postcolonialism and things like that. But Al-Hadatha is never discussed. And Al-Hadatha is a simple, Al-Hadatha means the new, not the modern. It's actually difficult to translate it from Arabic, but it's kind of a free new. So you can write any poetry, you can write any literature. You don't have to stick to any scale, you don't have to stick to any rhythm, any stanza, any of that, which is a bit like modern poetry in a sense, but a little bit more daring, I suppose, you know. And one of the most famous poets who actually led that movement was the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. A lot of you may know him here in the audience, who wrote beautiful poetry in Palestine. He wasn't from Gaza. I don't think he's ever made it to Gaza himself. He lived in Palestine, and then to the West Bank, and then Jordan afterwards. And the reason why Mahmoud Darwish became very famous is because his poetry became the literature of the symbol of the literature of resistance. And he says, and I quote in here, that I will say myself that Palestinians are not merciful to their men of letters. This is because of their faith in the effectiveness of literature, which has been to them a compensation to all the humiliations when they lost everything, referring to the events of 1948, except words. Literature then took strength from people to create a relationship between them and the lost home. A Palestinian writer is often asked, are you a writer or a freedom fighter? And as a writer myself, I can sort of confirm that, because everybody sort of asks me about, are your books part of the literature of resistance? And I'm like, I just write books. I don't really care about the literature of resistance. But there's a lot of expectations on Palestinian writers to sort of rise up and carry the national cause as much as possible. So Mahmoud Darwish is considered the founder of the literature of resistance, in a sense, along with people like Ghassan Kanafani. Is also considered one of the pioneers as well. He was born in 1942 in a little village called village of Barwa near Akka, Aysir. Darwish was one of the 800,000 Palestinians who was first deported in 1948 from his home village. Then he went back to his home village and stayed there for a while and fell in love with a Jewish girl. And he wrote beautiful poetry about her as well. And then later on, he moved to the West Bank, as I said, and became an integral part of the Palestinian resistance movement. In his ability to draw attention to national themes, while talking about the ordinary human matters like love, which brought recognition to Mahmoud Darwish, he wrote poetry with special uniqueness in the way that he presented the Palestinian cause through human emotions and through the connection to the land and people. But his ability to incorporate the young man's emotional concerns with the national concerns is what makes him and makes his work very unique. So a lot of his work is translated now to so many languages. You can look him up. I should have actually put his name out there somewhere, but I can give it to you later on. And he's celebrated as one of our national poets. We of course have many other poets at the moment, such as Tamim Barghouti, who is again carrying the flag of Mahmoud Darwish as being the national poet as well. I'm going to stop here, and I hope that I have given you a quick sort of overview, whistle stop of the Palestinian literature society and the changes that have happened over the last few years or few decades, I must say. And I hope that these works and these words will continue to make you understand the kind of complexity and the beauty of the Palestinian society as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed, for a really stimulating talk. I honestly didn't actually feel time passing, but we do have time for a couple of questions. We've got roving mics, so if you could put your hand up and we can then bring the microphone to you. Right, down here. Thank you.
Hello. So if I wanted to read some of the people that you've been talking about, is there a place I can find maybe the Pal Art Collective website or somewhere like that, I could find some of those authors listed, because I won't be able to remember them all. So can you recommend a spot I can find them?
Sure, yes. So I have to repeat the question for people who are online. So if you were to read some of the people that I mentioned in here, would you find them online? Yes, of course, you can find them online. However, I always like books and reading books. So the person I recommend is, and I mentioned I quoted her actually in here, Salma Khadra Jayusi, who wrote a lot about Palestinian literature. She's got an anthology of Arabic literature, and she really sort of dives deep into their work. So I would recommend that you check her work out, and then you can do all the Googling afterwards. And there is lots of websites that have the information in there.
I wanted to go back to a point where you described Gaza as being Nakba, I think you said. I can't remember what the meaning behind Nakba was, but I think it reflects the current state in which we are in. And you did say that to you, nothing's changed since 2000, and therefore you didn't want to go any further down. But I did wonder whether, well, I would like to know, when do we decide to give a name to a time period that has been symbolic to struggle or even to joy? And whether or not this past few months have been, anything similar to, anyway, I'm going to stop talking. But I hope you understand.
No, that's a really good question. So when do we decide to give a name to a particular decade or kind of a historical turning point? I don't know, to be honest with you. I'm not a historian myself, but I think we've got a historian in the audience. Avi, as you can see, you might be able to answer this question better than me. Do you have an answer to this question? So when do we decide to give a name to a certain sort of important political decade, let's say? Sorry to put you on the spot.
I remember a debate between about this very issue of turning points or landmarks in Palestinian history. And the debate was between Mustafa Badawi, who was a colleague of mine at the Middle East Center at St. Anthony's College, and his field was Arabic literature, and he wrote a book, a survey of Arabic literature. And Edward Said reviewed it in the London Review of Books, and he said that the book doesn't mention 1948 or 1967 or 1973 or 1982. Mustafa Badawi wrote a very angry reply, and he said, these are not important dates in Palestinian literature or in Arabic literature. So I don't really have an answer to the question, except that clearly there is a link between history and literature. Mm-hmm. I would like to say, from my own experience as an Iraqi Jew who moved to Israel when I was 5 years old, that there is a lot of literature about the exodus from Iraq and the move to Israel. And when Iraqi Jews arrived in Israel, they were put in transit camps. It was a very painful move. And there is the literature of the Ma'barot, the literature of the transit camps. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that in Palestinian literature, 1948 is bound to be the critical date. And a lot of the literature revolves around, as you explained, particularly Ghassan Kanafani.
Yeah. It takes a while. I mean, I think it takes a while sometimes to reflect back on that period. So I think in reference, again, back to your question, is that we're living these moments now and these months and those defining moments. I think it takes a while to reflect back on it and define it for what it was, because we're not out of it yet. In a sense, like, I think, if you look at the pandemic, for example, in here, that in 10 years, 20 years time, we'll define it differently from what we define it right now, I suppose. So I think it will take a bit of time. But just want to say that for those of you who don't know, Avi Shleim is one of the well-known historians on Israel, Palestine, and here. So I'm really pleased that he's taken that question for me, and apologies for to put you on the spot. But also the reason why I was nervous as I'm giving the lecture to have him in the audience as well. So when is history
I'm just wondering, you said that, you know, it takes time, but I'm just wondering when is history most true, whether it's within the struggle, during the struggle, or if the struggle has sort of eased.
Yeah, I mean, the struggle always draws in history. History is important for the struggle, and the struggle will define history, but later, I suppose, when we look at it later. I think we are still going through the events right now until we know where we land and where we end up with. We won't know how to define it, in my opinion, you know. And it also depends which side of the fence you're sitting on, I suppose, you know, that's another important definition for it. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk today. I was really struck when you were talking about your personal history, that your grandfather had his, you know, concerns stopped and was looking for his brother, didn't know. You are in the same position 2 generations afterwards. And the word repetition came to mind. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the place of repetition in Palestinian life in Gaza, in poetry, and whether there is a link. Thanks.
It's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, again, kind of related to the first question, that in a sense, we are still living it and we don't know where it's going to end. So it's clear now with the events and what's happening is that Israel is really keen on annexing Gaza and taking the north where my family lives. So to a large extent, a lot of people are drawing analysis and comparison to what happened in 1948 to now. And it is happening because they've kind of destroyed all kind of functional life in the north completely. Hospitals destroyed, schools, all of that. This is a well-known fact on the news if you have followed it. I think the kind of the analysis or the similarities there is the pain of loss, I suppose. You know, I feel it right now. I feel it because my mum left to the south. Our family house is empty. It could be taken over. It could be destroyed. And that is just, yeah, the pain I can feel for my grandfather so much, and I never understood. And I actually remember asking my grandfather before. I said to him, why did you allow the Nakba to happen? Why did you run away from your home? And there, how could you not stay and fight for it and resist? And I don't think he ever gave me a good answer, but now I know completely, because people are running away for safety and for their life as much as possible because of the atrocities that we have seen. And when my mum left, I was for 2 days. The last few days, I didn't know where she was. It took her 2 days to get there. No connection, no phone connection whatsoever. So that was my priority to start with. And then as I knew that she got home, she got to my uncle's house in the south, I was relieved. And then my immediate thought was that pain about the house that is empty and that loss, and that the fact that she might never be able to go back. So those similarities are really there. But is it going to end up the same situation? I don't know, because we're still living through the events. There's still a lot happening. There's a lot of international pressure. There's still a lot of negotiations. The facts on the ground say, yes, Israel has taken the north now completely. But things could change in a way. But again, the other sort of, not similarity, but differences here, I hope that there's enough more awareness now of people seeing that, so they don't allow that sort of land grab to take place. I'm talking about the international community. Yeah, it's a painful one, I have to say. It's a completely painful one.
I think that's probably all we've got time for tonight. Time passes quickly. Thank you again so much for a stimulating lecture, but also for sharing your personal experiences, which of course enrich that kind of lecture enormously. Thank you to the audience for listening, for fantastic questions. And yes, let's put our hands together for Ahmed.